I think the dollar is going to be rejected on the global stage, and the majority of Americans won't even know it.
This video is brought to you by Reluctant Preppers. Click here to subscribe for free to reluctantpreppers.com. Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with FinanceAndLiberty.com, and back with us today is Dr. Jim Willie, editor of the Hat-Trick Letter found on GoldenJackass.com. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be back. It's been a couple months, a lot of events, and not too much in the way of favorable events. It's all kind of a degradation that's on automatic and has a lot of pushes for all the elements going downhill. We're seeing extreme desperations here, Elijah, desperation, and things going far more out of control than appear.
Right, and I'd like to discuss an article that you wrote recently titled Germany Pivoting East, and you explained that, quote, Germany will break from the US and UK and its US dollar fiat currency regime. Can you explain a little bit why you see this happening and possibly when?
Sure. It'd be a pleasure to do that. We've got an extreme situation here with Germany. There are four reasons that Germany has really had enough. I mean, we're all aware that the NSA has been bugging Merkel's office. The NSA is actually doing far more with these bugs than we realize. They're stealing corporate secrets. They're getting the leg up. They're getting an advantage of learning what's going on with, say, developments on Russian big projects, commercial projects, and they're trying to get into the way of them. There are many different examples. It even goes as far as to Australia, where the Australian-Japanese trade talks were bugged, where the Japanese room was bugged. And the Japanese are very angry about this. So, okay, the NSA is one case. The Euro Central Bank is another with Germany. They're sick of Draghi. They had the German High Court announce that their long-term finance operation, LTRO, there's an acronym. It was a patch. It was a Draghi patch that set about different seniority for sovereign bond ownership so the big banks would have the advantage. And the German High Court just slammed it down, said this is not legal. Not only does it violate the EU contracts and consortium of agreements and a grand concordance, but it's just absurd. Okay, there's a third and a fourth. Gee, I don't have them right in front of my face. The Germans don't want to cut off Russian supply of gas. It just makes no sense. They can't legitimately replace their 40% dependence on Russia for gas and their 30% dependence on Russia for oil. So the Germans are in a bad spot. They realize that this is not going well and it's not going to get better. And the deeper they get involved with the United States through the EU facade, these are fascists. I mean, I don't know if your listeners are aware, but not only is the United States a fascist regime, but so is Britain and the European Union. And so is a little ally in the southeast corner of the Mediterranean that has a gigantic role in Ukraine. Well, the Germans don't want to commit any further for this war. It just doesn't make any, it's not that it doesn't make any sense, it's suicidal. They don't want to commit German troops. They don't want to interrupt Russian contracts. They don't want to interrupt Russian supply of natural gas. They don't want to disturb their giant LNG facilities in the north on the coast. They don't want to have an economic collapse just because the United States wants to impose sanctions on Russia. The sanctions against Russia are going to result in unbelievable isolation for the United States. The U.S. and Washington and Wall Street handlers are essentially going to cut off Europe with their pressure for war. They've done something incredibly stupid, apart from war. They've told the Europeans, we can make up all the natural gas and crude oil that you would cut off from Russian supply lines. And they're thinking, well, we got this big fracking industry for natural gas. This is just ridiculously stupid. And they say we have all this shale development of oil. This is also ridiculously stupid. A quick look at the analysis for fracking of gas and shale for oil reveals that the depletion rates are incredibly rapid. And the write-down of the Monterey shale project in California was of 96% of its reserves. So Obama's got a sham of an energy plan to offer on the plate to Europeans. And they see it as such. They also know far better than the U.S. that fracking contaminates the groundwater system. So farming and agricultural industry do not coincide well, do not coexist well with fracking for gas. I mean, we're just full of dumb strategic elements. So the Germans are realizing that they can't continue. And they made a decision, my sources indicate, at least 3 or 4 months ago, maybe before the Ukraine situation broke out. I have told some other hosts and other sources, other entities out there in the media, that we could have seen the outbreak of war in Ukraine because of financial reset, think currencies, gold, etc., because a big reset was going to happen in February. So the U.S. interfered with that. I mean, I don't know if your listeners really understand. I think some do, and the majority do not, that the Ukraine movement for the coup d'etat and the installation of the fascists, I don't want to get into all the names, but the fascists who are running things now in Ukraine and conducted the coup d'etat, they're basically funded by Langley. They're funded by George Soros. Their operations are with, BlackRock? I get all the blacks confused. They're going by different names now to confuse everybody. But these are the paid mercenary killers that Langley, with U.S. government security agencies, has hired and trained. And they've done the same with ISIS, the rebel guerrillas that are attacking Syria and Iraq. They're all from Langley. They're supplied by Langley. They're trained by Langley. They're funded by Langley and by George Soros. So the Germans have decided, I think even before Ukraine hit, they had their hand called, like a big poker game. All right, are you with us or not? The NATO hand. And they decided, okay, we'll commit some NATO forces and aircraft and whatever for Ukraine. And yeah, aren't they really bad over there in Russia? I mean, gosh, I think the Western press is going to have a severe fallout for their own credibility by their coverage of the Ukraine war as it applies to German activity. I don't want to get into the downed aircraft. I don't want to get into any of that. I prefer to point to how the U.S. mercenaries with hoods on their head at 2 a.m. in the Borispol, not Air Force Base, airport in Kiev in March, stole 44 tons of gold. Okay, I thought we had protocol problems in New York Fed for not returning German gold in the repatriation. No, they showed their protocol is excellent with hooded masks and mercenaries operating in the middle of the night. So they stole 44 tons of gold, and they also stole, they call it a transfer for safekeeping, $70 billion in Ukraine official accounts, government accounts, And they stole all the former prime minister's family's money, and they put it all in Switzerland. $70 billion. Do you think the Ukraine economy is going to do okay without their central bank gold? You think it's going to do okay without their government funds? You think it's going to do okay without some oligarch big accounts? You think it's going to do okay without any planting season in some of the best farmland in the world, comparable to Iowa? No, we're on the clock here for the implosion of Kiev. And from what I'm hearing, their troops are surrounded without water, ammunition, and other supplies. So, this is all falling apart. Germany has told China and other Pacific Rim client states that they're getting out. And the word I'm having is not only this word from my London banker source, but confirmed by my gold trader who I called, my source I call The Voice. He's been with me since 2008 and gave me a firm preview a month in advance of Lehman, AIG, and Fannie Mae. He didn't actually identify AIG. I couldn't guess it. I guessed two of the three, and he said, well, you'll have to find out what the third one is. It has to do with insurance. So he gave me a preview. I was told in July and August before the September breakdown of Lehman. Anyway, this guy has all kinds of connections and is involved in many different things, and I think involved in some of the planning for the BRICS currency that's coming up. But the Germans want out, and they realize that their future lies with the Eurasian trade zone by maintaining excellent commercial and trade ties with Germany. Germany maintains ties with Russia and with China. And to do that, they're going to have to embrace some kind of currency reform. And reform's a nice word for abandoning the dollar. So that's where I think we're going here, Elijah.
So how do you see Germany breaking away from the U.S. fiat currency regime affecting the U.S. dollar?
Well, rejection of the dollar and much more limited use in European trade, much more limited use in Asian trade, much more limited use in South American trade, much more limited use even between, say, Australia, New Zealand, with China. So when you touch on all the continents and say there's going to be reduced dollar usage, what you're saying is it's going to lose its global reserve currency status. Now, a lot of people don't quite make the connection, but if you have trade between two countries and it's not in the dollar, neither country will want to hold treasury bonds. If they're a viable country, like, say, India or Japan or Korea or Russia with an economy, they're not going to want to store treasury bonds. So when the trade is reduced in dollar usage for settlement, these countries are going to dump their treasury bonds. And this is what Ukraine is all about. Russia doesn't want to use the dollar anymore. They're telling the Europeans, we might just settle in euros and eventually in rubles. And maybe if it's convenient to you countries, if you've got a lot of yuan lying around, we can use the Chinese currency. I'd like to point out, some people are confused by what renminbi is. Maybe it's a different kind of Chinese currency. No, it is a Chinese currency. Renminbi in Chinese means people's money. So when you talk about renminbi or RMB, you're talking about the Chinese yuan. You're talking about the Chinese currency. You're just using an informal word for it, RMB. It's kind of like saying, well, I got $8 million here that you're going to spend. Well, gee, so the dollar the United States has two currencies, the dollar and the buck? No, the dollar is the buck. The dollar is also the greenback. So you've got these numerous names. When Germany uses the dollar less in its trade, you're going to see a rather sudden impact for the United States and its economy. You're starting to see some of the early transition activity where, say, the Keystone Pipeline is going to be approved, where, say, different rules from the Department of Energy were just announced regarding the definition of how you say, condensates, forms of crude oil before its refinement. I mean, just think of, say, the shale oil that we are producing. It's not thick. It's not like West Texas crude, which is very thick and high viscosity. Some of the crude oil produced by the U.S. Sources, the wellheads, is kind of thin on viscosity. So the U.S. government changed rules. Well, why did they change the rule for making it easier to export our crude oil production? I think the answer is simple, because they're trying to prepare for the dollar being rejected on a global basis for trade settlement. And if that does happen, here's the effect of the U.S. economy. The U.S. is going to have to make sure that it draws in foreign currency on its exports in order to try to maintain a balance that will be impossible to achieve. Because take a look, our trade deficit, it's still $300 to $400 billion a year. It's still $30 to $40 billion a month. You can't make up for that with condensate. You can't make up for that with fracked gas. I mean, these are moronic strategic elements. So Germany is on track for getting rid of the dollar. And I'd like to point out some of their strategy that I believe is at work. They don't want to have a quick movement where they say, we're going to get off the euro here. We're going straight to Russian ruble and Chinese RMB and maybe some gold settlement. We're going to do it next month. They don't want to do that because they will be blamed for bringing down the U.S. economy and financial structure. Instead, they're going to wait for it to destroy itself, to decline and to collapse on its own weight. And then they'll come in and everybody will see, oh gosh, the whole system is broken. Oh, look at that. Germany's going to use a system that they had in place at the ready, but they hadn't announced yet. So it looks like Germany is not responsible for the U.S. collapse. Russia is employing the same strategy. They don't want to be responsible for the U.S. collapse. But when the U.S., through its mercenaries, invaded and did a coup d'etat in Kiev, Ukraine, and blamed it on Russia, it's outrageous. We did the coup and blamed Russia for confiscating, advancing, annexing Crimea. No, they merely took over their naval port for the Russian Navy and immediately conducted in the next weekend a referendum in the whole province of Crimea, which voted 93 or 95% to join Russia. The news was not in the U.S. press. It's very important to look at what's not in the U.S. press, what's not reported as a theme. And when you don't have the news of, say, Russia ordering a referendum in Crimea the weekend after they marched in to take control of their naval port. The Crimean naval port is their only warm water port in the world. It's on the Black Sea. They weren't going to lose it, and the U.S. tried to cut it off. But when the U.S. press does not report that the Russians immediately set up a referendum for the Crimean province, and it came out as a 93 or 95% in favor of joining Russia. I look at, why did the U.S. press not report that? I look at what the U.S. press does not report and what motive might be there for an inference. So if they're going to maintain the story that the Russians, the big bad Russians, came in there and overran Crimea and killed people and just took over a country and annexed it illegally, then why did they leave out the story of doing a referendum? The answer is simple, because they don't want the Americans to know that the U.S. was responsible for the Kiev coup d'etat, the installation of Langley fascists, and really they don't want you to trace back that probably the fascists in New York and the CIA were responsible for a whole string of events going all the way back to the Kennedy assassination. I did some quick research here. This wasn't, deep hourly historical reading and referencing. But if you look back to some of the killed U.S. presidents, you had a sequence of Garfield, McKinley, and Lincoln. They're all killed. They were all gold and bimetal advocates. Bimetal standard means gold and silver. Garfield was killed when he kept on promoting the bimetallic standard. McKinley was killed shortly after being reelected, I believe, when he actually ran on the platform of making sure that we have prosperity from the gold standard. Lincoln didn't promote the gold standard, but he did something very unusual. During a time of war, he turned down London for financing the Civil War, and he issued the Continental Dollar, which resulted in tremendous losses for its investors later. I think it was 90% write-downs in the years following the war. But why is it that in U.S. Civil War history books, we don't ever hear about the London bankers being turned down for financing the war, but we do hear about the Continental Dollar, and we don't hear about all the op-ed weekly items in the London Times calling for the death of Lincoln. Week after week after week, the death to Lincoln. So I believe a common theme with the murder, assassination of U.S. presidents going back 140 years has been to eliminate the presidents who are in favor of the gold standard, which includes Kennedy. And I'd like to point out that in the rapid-fire assassination of Garfield, McKinley, and Lincoln, it was only 30 years later or 25 years later that the Federal Reserve was created. So they said, enough of this. We're getting tired of killing your presidents. We'd rather just set up an institution to do our dirty work, and that's the Federal Reserve. Now, this is extremely complicated, and I believe Germany is going to be the linchpin that unhooks the U.S. from Europe. It's not just that they're going to walk away from the euro and embrace a BRICS new currency, the Germans. It's more like the Germans are going to walk away from the European Union and sever their political and military commitments to the United States and Britain. This is more like abandoning NATO. So if you haven't figured out there, you listeners, that the dollar is being defended by war and military, you're really not up to speed. You're barely even crawling.
Hey everyone, that's it for part 1. Make sure to click here to subscribe so you don't miss part 2. This video was brought to you by ReluctantPreppers.com. Click here to hear the latest report from a prepping father who moved his family of 12 from the city to the nearby countryside and tells how he's raising meat for his family and rediscovered a shocking wild meat source too.